The divorce papers were still warm from the printer when Marcus Hale walked out of the courthouse with nothing but a small suitcase, an old wristwatch, and the crushing realization that the woman he had loved for 11 years no longer wanted him. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He didn't even turn around when his wife, Rebecca, walked toward her waiting car with another man standing beside her. Marcus simply lowered his eyes, tightened his grip on the suitcase, and started walking down the courthouse steps. But he had barely reached the sidewalk when a long black limousine silently pulled up beside him. The rear window lowered, and the billionaire sitting inside looked directly at Marcus and said something that made him stop breathing. If you believe people deserve kindness, second chances, and the opportunity to rebuild their lives after heartbreak, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who may need hope today, and subscribe to the channel. You never know whose heart might be saved by a story like this. Marcus had once believed his marriage would last forever. He and Rebecca had met when they were both struggling young adults in Charlotte, North Carolina. Marcus worked long hours repairing commercial air conditioning systems while Rebecca was studying interior design at a community college. They had very little money, but they had something Marcus thought was worth more than wealth: each other. Their first apartment was a tiny second-floor unit above a bakery, where the smell of fresh bread drifted through the windows every morning. They celebrated birthdays with grocery store cakes, watched old movies on a second-hand television, and dreamed about buying a house someday. When Marcus proposed, he couldn't afford an expensive ring, so he had saved for months to buy a simple gold band. Rebecca had cried when she saw it, telling him that she didn't need diamonds because she already had the man she wanted. For years, Marcus worked as hard as any man could. He took overtime whenever it was offered. He skipped vacations. He repaired his own aging truck instead of buying another one. When Rebecca wanted to open a small interior design studio, Marcus used nearly all of his savings to help her rent a modest office. He believed her dreams were their dreams. But somewhere along the way, things began changing. Rebecca's business grew, and with success came new friends, expensive dinners, business events, and a lifestyle Marcus couldn't afford. She started coming home later. Conversations became shorter. The small apartment they once shared was replaced by a beautiful suburban house, but somehow the house felt colder than their old place above the bakery. Marcus kept telling himself that every marriage went through difficult seasons. He tried harder. He brought flowers home. He planned weekend trips. He cooked dinner. He asked Rebecca what was wrong. She always told him that she was tired, busy, or stressed. Marcus accepted every explanation because admitting the truth would have meant accepting that the woman he loved was slowly leaving him while still living under the same roof. Then came the night everything collapsed. Rebecca sat across from him at the kitchen table with a folder in front of her. She looked calm, almost strangely peaceful. Marcus knew something was wrong before she even opened the folder. Inside were divorce papers. She had already hired an attorney. The decision had been made. There would be no counseling, no attempt to repair the marriage, and no conversation about starting again. Rebecca wanted a different life, and Marcus was no longer part of it. Marcus read the papers slowly. His hands trembled, but he kept his face still. He saw the division of property, the financial arrangements, and the final sentence that made his chest feel hollow: the marriage would be terminated. He looked at Rebecca for a long moment, hoping to see even a small sign of regret. There was none. She had already emotionally moved on. Marcus realized that he had been fighting for a marriage that had ended months, perhaps years, earlier. The next morning, he packed one suitcase. He left behind the furniture he had worked so hard to buy. He left the television, the photographs, the expensive kitchen appliances, and even the framed wedding picture hanging above the fireplace. The only things he took were a few clothes, his father's old wristwatch, a photograph of his late mother, and the worn leather wallet he had carried since he was 21. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want to make Rebecca feel guilty. Most of all, he didn't want to give her the satisfaction of watching him break down in front of her. So he left without a word. Outside the courthouse in downtown Charlotte, the afternoon sun reflected off the glass buildings. People hurried past him, talking on phones and carrying coffee cups, completely unaware that Marcus's entire world had just collapsed. He stood there for a few seconds, staring at the city as if he had never seen it before. Then he picked up his suitcase and started walking. He had no home waiting for him. He had no family nearby. He had only a few $100s in his bank account and no idea where he would sleep that night. But Marcus kept walking. 3 blocks from the courthouse, his legs became heavy. He stopped beside a bus shelter and sat down. He opened his wallet and looked at the old photograph of his mother. She had been gone for 8 years, but Marcus could still remember what she used to tell him when life became difficult. A person's value isn't measured by what they own, but by what they refuse to become when life hurts them. Marcus closed his eyes. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to cry. He didn't know that someone was watching him. Across the street, inside a black luxury limousine, sat a man named Jonathan Whitmore, one of the wealthiest businessmen in North Carolina. Jonathan owned a nationwide logistics company, several technology investments, and a foundation that quietly funded shelters, hospitals, and scholarships. He had been leaving a business meeting when his driver noticed Marcus sitting alone with a suitcase. Jonathan initially paid little attention, but then he saw the old photograph in Marcus's hand. Something about the man's expression stopped him. Jonathan had seen thousands of people in his life. He had met politicians, CEOs, celebrities, investors, and people who would do almost anything for money. But the broken man sitting at the bus stop reminded him of someone he hadn't thought about in years. His younger brother, Caleb. Caleb had died at 32 after losing his business, his marriage, and almost everything he believed defined him. Jonathan remembered how people had treated Caleb after his failure. They stopped returning his calls. Friends disappeared. Business partners blamed him. Even relatives avoided him because they were uncomfortable around someone who had fallen so far. Jonathan had regretted one thing for the rest of his life. He hadn't shown up soon enough. He lowered the window and asked his driver to pull over. The limousine stopped beside Marcus. Marcus looked up, confused. He assumed the driver wanted to tell him the bus stop was blocked. But when the rear door opened, Jonathan stepped out himself. Marcus recognized him immediately. Everyone in Charlotte knew Jonathan Whitmore. His face appeared in business magazines and local news reports. Marcus had once installed air conditioning systems in one of Jonathan's warehouses years earlier. Jonathan approached him without bodyguards, without arrogance, and without asking what had happened. He simply looked at Marcus and asked whether he was all right. Marcus almost laughed at the question. He wasn't all right. His marriage had ended, his home was gone, and he had nowhere to sleep. But instead of telling a billionaire stranger his problems, Marcus simply nodded. Jonathan studied him for several seconds and then noticed the wristwatch on Marcus's arm. It was an old silver watch with a cracked leather strap. Jonathan's face changed. He recognized it. That watch had belonged to his own father. Marcus didn't understand why the billionaire was staring at it. Jonathan reached into his coat and pulled out his phone. He asked Marcus where he had gotten the watch. Marcus explained that his father had bought it at a pawn shop many years earlier. His father had died when Marcus was young, and the watch had become the only possession he had from him. Jonathan looked stunned. Then he asked Marcus to show him the back of the watch. Marcus removed it. Engraved beneath the worn strap was a tiny set of initials. JW. Jonathan's eyes filled with tears. Years earlier, his father had owned 2 identical watches. One had been given to Jonathan. The other had been given to Caleb. When Caleb died, Jonathan believed the second watch had been buried with him. But it hadn't. It had somehow ended up in Marcus's family. Jonathan asked Marcus where his father had purchased it. Marcus remembered the name of a small pawn shop in Charlotte. Jonathan knew that shop. His father had owned it briefly as an investment decades ago. The coincidence was too extraordinary to ignore. Jonathan didn't tell Marcus everything immediately. Instead, he invited him into the limousine. Marcus hesitated. He had spent his entire life earning everything himself. Accepting help from a billionaire felt uncomfortable. But Jonathan told him that sometimes pride becomes another form of loneliness. Those words reached Marcus. He climbed inside. As the limousine moved through the streets of Charlotte, Jonathan began asking questions. Not about Marcus's divorce, but about his work, his character, and what he wanted from life. Marcus admitted that he had once dreamed of starting his own commercial maintenance company. He knew the industry from the ground up, but he had never had enough capital to take the risk. Jonathan listened carefully. Then he revealed the truth about the watch. Caleb had been his younger brother, and years before Marcus was born, Caleb had worked with a small maintenance contractor. One of his closest friends had been Marcus's father. The connection suddenly made sense. Marcus's father had helped Caleb during the darkest period of his life. When Caleb's business collapsed, Marcus's father had given him work, a place to stay, and the dignity to start again. Marcus sat silently as Jonathan told him what happened next. Caleb eventually rebuilt his life, but his success was short-lived. Before he died, he had written several letters to people who had helped him. One letter was addressed to Marcus's father. Jonathan had kept copies of those letters, and in one of them, Caleb had written that if he ever became successful again, he wanted to repay the man who had refused to abandon him when everyone else did. But Caleb died before he could. Jonathan had spent years searching for Marcus's father, hoping to repay an old debt. He had never found him. Until that afternoon, Marcus suddenly understood why Jonathan had looked at him differently. The billionaire wasn't helping a stranger. He was honoring a promise made decades ago. Jonathan offered Marcus something no divorce settlement could provide, a chance to begin again. He offered him a position managing a new division of his company, with enough resources to eventually launch his own maintenance business under Jonathan's mentorship. Marcus didn't accept immediately. He asked why a billionaire would trust a man who had just lost everything. Jonathan smiled sadly and told him that people who have never lost anything often don't understand what it means to rebuild. But someone who has lost everything and still chooses to remain decent is worth betting on. Marcus accepted. The months that followed were difficult. Healing wasn't instant. Some nights Marcus still woke up thinking about Rebecca. Some mornings he stared at the ceiling wondering how 11 years of marriage could disappear so quickly. But slowly, life began giving him new reasons to get out of bed. He worked harder than ever. He treated employees with respect. He remembered the names of janitors, drivers, assistants, and technicians. When a young employee made a costly mistake, Marcus didn't humiliate him. He remembered what it felt like to be at your lowest. Within 2 years, Marcus's division became one of Jonathan's most successful operations. But something even more important happened. Marcus became happy again. Not because he became wealthy, not because his ex-wife regretted leaving, but because he finally understood that losing someone who didn't value him wasn't the end of his story. One evening, Marcus received an envelope from Rebecca. She had heard about his success. Her business had struggled, her new relationship had ended, and she wanted to meet. Marcus read the letter twice. For a moment, the old pain returned. Then he folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. He didn't feel hatred. He simply realized he no longer needed an apology to move forward. Years later, Marcus stood outside a newly built community center funded by Jonathan's foundation. The center provided job training for people recovering from homelessness, divorce, unemployment, and financial hardship. Jonathan stood beside him as a crowd gathered for the opening. Marcus looked at the building and remembered the man sitting alone at a bus stop with one suitcase and nowhere to go. That man had believed his life was over. He had been wrong. Sometimes life doesn't destroy you. Sometimes it removes what was holding you back. And sometimes, when you think nobody sees your pain, a stranger pulls up beside you and reminds you that your story isn't finished. Marcus reached into his pocket and touched his father's old watch. The leather was still worn. The glass was still cracked. But he never replaced it. Because every time he looked at it, he remembered that kindness can travel through generations, and a good deed done decades ago can return when you least expect it. If this story touched your heart, please don't just watch silently. Like the video, share it with someone who may be going through a painful season, and subscribe for more stories about hope, kindness, and second chances. Your support helps these stories reach people who may need them at exactly the right moment. And before we end, I have one special request. Comment, "My story isn't finished," if you believe that losing someone or something doesn't mean losing yourself. Marcus thought the day he walked away from his marriage was the day his life ended. Instead, it became the day his second life began. He left the courthouse with one suitcase. Minutes later, a billionaire's limousine pulled up. But the greatest thing that limousine carried him toward wasn't money, success, or a new career. It carried him toward the realization that sometimes the door that closes behind you is the very door that finally sets you free.